Our topic was intellectual and cultural trends in the interwar years. The topics we decided to focus on were philosophy, literature, art, music, religion, food, propaganda, architecture, and science. Philosophers once believed that there was almost no point in discovering answers to questions about the ultimate reality. Throughout the century of the interwar years, philosophers began to search for explanations of human behavior. Two of the most influential philosophers were Ludwig Wittgenstein, who along with Bertrand Russell founded the school of logical positivism. Logical positivism then emerged as a scientific philosophy which was further developed by the Vienna Circle, whose leader was Rudolf Carnap. Philosophy was used to discover truth using the facts of the physical environment. Political theory became a target as it was seen as a burden. Writings of philosophers during this time reflected a sense of crisis and despair.
Literary movements during the interwar period were similar to those in philosophy. These novelists, poets, and dramatists were delusioned by the brute facts of World War and by the failure of victory to fulfill its promises. Literature reflects themes of frustration, cynicism, and disenchantment. American Ernest Hemingway set a pattern, describing the tragedy of the lost generation in his work, The Sun Also Rises. This pattern was followed by other writers such as American F. Scott Fitzgerald. An Anglo-American poet, T.S. Eliot, presented a philosophy that was close to despair in his poem The Wasteland. This philosophy recommended that life was a living death. German Bertolt Brecht proclaimed the corruption of the bourgeois state and the pointlessness of the war, through his plays that were written to be performed before the proletarian patrons of cabinets. Many writers of the interwar period reflected the isolation of self-conscious intellectuals and the constricting of the audience. Irishman James Joyce entered his characters' minds to reproduce their stream of consciousness. Englishwoman Virginia Woolf was a critic of the ruling class of Britain through her novels and essays. Woolf focused on the enforced oppression of women even in that class. The methods and purposes of literature were reinforced after the Depression of the 1930s. Literature then became very politicized. Authors began to address meanness and cruelty. Novels written by the Frenchman André Malraux suggested that the human struggle against tyranny and injustice is what gives meaning and values to life. Youth British writers such as W. H. Auden, Stephen Spender, and Christopher Isherwood were communist sympathizers who declared that artists had an obligation to politicize their art for the benefit of the revolution. On the other hand, Englishman George Orwell was a writer who insisted that political movements were, to some degree, corrupted. He expressed his mistrust of political regimes in his last two novels, Animal Farm and 1984, written right after World War II. Optimism during the 1930s was expressed by writers who advocated a violent change in the social order.
The violence and struggles of the First World War had such a negative impact on the spirits of so many that religion was often questioned. It was hard for people to grasp the concept of purpose in our universe where so many terrible things had happened. Many philosophers and sociologists during the interwar years were strongly against metaphysics and trying to understand the science and purpose of ultimate reality. Instead, they urged society to view religion as a cultural asset and not as a science that could be understood. The most influential sociologist against the value of metaphysics was Max Weber. Weber was a German sociologist who wrote the book The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. In his book, he argued that religion must be understood as an aspect of culture and that emphasis should be put on the importance of work ethic within a society in order to better the society. His work directly assisted in the spread of capitalism. This was done by influencing members of society to believe that work and effort were a part of religion and were necessary to better oneself as well as a nation as a whole. Weber believed that a charismatic leadership was necessary in order to escape the deadening tyranny of state control. Charisma is a word derived from the Greek word meaning gift. His concept of charisma was often interpreted that if one did their part, their leaders or government would reward them for it. These more cultural and sociological views of religion helped people regain their spirits as well as boost the productivity and advancement of government and economics.
Music in the 1920s changed dramatically and rapidly. In the first place, music became more accessible because of radio, records, and the phonograph. Trumpeter Louis Armstrong helped usher in a new era of music, the Jazz Age. Considered to be rebellious and alternative, jazz both influenced and reflected the carefree, boisterous atmosphere of the 1920s. Fresh out of a horrifying war, people wanted to relax and regain a sense of joy in their lives. Jazz, along with films and new dance styles, gave people the opportunity to do just that. In addition to jazz, Hawaiian music became a fad, and ukuleles became one of the most popular instruments. In addition to Louis Armstrong, popular jazz musicians of the time included Bessie Smith and Joe King Oliver. Classical music also experienced changes to reflect the carefree times. Composers George Gershwin and Aaron Copland integrated new styles and influences into their compositions. In the 1930s, America was struck by a crushing depression. The effects were felt around the world, and it influenced all aspects of cultural and intellectual trends, including music and food. Swing and big band music became more popular, as well as so-called hillbilly music. Farmers who moved from the country into towns and cities brought their music with them, and it became a fad. Music helped people cope with the Depression. Benny Goodman led a popular band, while Billie Holiday called awareness to the horrors of racism with her song Strange Fruit. Although African American musicians were extremely well liked, they were often only heard on recordings due to segregation of live performance venues. Food in the interwar years changed a great deal due to technology and the Great Depression. Prohibition, which was passed in 1919, forbade manufacturing, importing, selling, and consuming alcohol. People still continued to produce and consume alcohol, but the rate dropped from what it had been previously. Prohibition led to an increased popularity of sodas, such as Dr. Pepper and Coca-Cola. In the 1920s, although the restaurant business started growing, most meals were still eaten at home. Packaged and convenience foods, such as Kool-Aid, baby food, and potato chips, reached the market. Food variety increased because of technology. Growing numbers of people were able to eat foods like grapefruit, broccoli, and bananas, and food prices decreased due to the emergence of chain grocery stores and agricultural advancements. In the 1930s, the importance of vitamins was realized in Western nations. Vitamin supplements and vitamin-enriched foods were seen for the first time. Because of the Depression, ease of food preparation became a focus. Simple meals were common. Easy-to-prepare foods like Bisquick, Spam, Ragu spaghetti sauce, and Kraft macaroni and cheese were introduced. Refrigerators and freezers became popular, which helped increase the amount of fresh food people in cities could eat. In America, people ate most meals at home to save money, while in Europe, the effects of war were still being felt, which also caused people to eat at home.
Propaganda was a form of art in the interwar years. It was used to make populations believe only what the governments wished them to believe. 19th and 20th century governments encouraged literacy, fearing an ignorant working class as a revolutionary threat. Authoritarian regimes then used education as a means of propagating a party line. Youth programs instructed children in the virtues of the state. Adolf Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, "All effective propaganda has to limit itself to very few points and to use them like slogans." Using propaganda was made more effective by mass circulation through publishing, radio, and motion pictures. Newspapers reached a wider audience than ever before, but only printed what the state wanted to be printed. Party political broadcasts were heard through the radio, whose repetitiveness led to people accepting and believing what they knew to be untrue. The film Triumph of the Will was a visual hymn to the Nordic race and the Nazi regime. The Russian director, Sergei Eisenstein, rewrote Russian history on film to serve the ends of the Soviet state. Of Western democracies was not manipulated by the state. Advertising became an industry after the realization of the mass markets of newspapers, magazines, and radio. Popular culture and propaganda remained a powerful and alarming new fact of life. Powerful because of vast audiences, and alarming because of its ability to control the minds of men and women.
During the interwar years, trends in art were similar to trends in literature, in the sense that both explored frontiers far beyond the average conventional taste. The two were also similar in that they expressed darker and more painful perceptions of life. For example, George Grasset's painting titled The Funeral Procession is a very dark and negative portrayal of death triumphing over humanity as a result of man's past decisions and what the world was becoming. Expressionists argued that a painting didn't need to have a subject or protocol. However, many works of art during the interwar years dealt with political thoughts and opinions because of the many conflicting beliefs and obviously also because of the situations that were occurring globally at that time.
Science started with the German physicist Albert Einstein, who was theorizing and experiments were revolutionizing. Einstein began to challenge not to the older concepts of matter, but practically the entire structures of traditional physics. Einstein set out to work to reconstruct the scheme of the universe in accordance with a different pattern. Einstein added a new dimension of time and represented all four as fused in the synthesis that is called the space-time continuum. He theorized had major influence in participating another revolutionary development in physics, the splitting of atoms to release the energy contained within it. Einstein became convinced of the equivalence of mass and energy and worked out a formula which is expressed as E = mc squared. In 1939, two German physicists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, succeeded in splitting atoms of uranium by bombing them with neutrons. The first use of the knowledge of the atomic fission was in the preparation of an atomic bomb. The decision to use the atomic bomb was an attack on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima. The atomic bomb was more than a weapon of terrible destruction. It was a psychological weapon, a device that would further heighten the anxiety of the era. Architecture in the 1880s to 1890s, the designers in Europe and America announced the prevailing styles of building constructions that were out of harmony with modern civilization. Otto Wagner in Germany and Charles Genevieve in France, Louis Sullivan in the Fran Wright in the United States. The appearance of a building should proclaim its actual use and purpose. There must be no additional fronces, columns, traceries, or battlements. The true beauty should consist in an honest adaptation of materials to the purpose they intend to serve. Walter Gropius, who in 1919 established a school to serve a center for theory and practice of modern architecture.